They say you can know a forest like the back of your hand. You can map every ridge, every stream, and every hidden trail. But the mountain doesn't care about your expertise. In November 1945, Mid-Dye Rivers, a man who spent his entire life mastering the wilderness of Glastonbury, stepped into the woods and didn't just get lost. He vanished. Not a footprint, not a trace, just nothing. And that was only the beginning. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. What really happened? Because every case you are about to hear has one thing in common. The investigation was closed. The file was sealed. And the truth was never found. These are the cases that detectives couldn't solve, that witnesses couldn't explain, and that official records couldn't account for. If you are someone who needs to know what really happened, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Unsolved Vault and join thousands of investigators uncovering the case's history left unfinished. Welcome back. This is Unsolved Vault. And today, we open a case that was never meant to stay closed. In November of 1945, a 68-year-old man named Mid-Dye Rivers entered the forests near Glastonbury Mountain with a group of hunters. He was not an outsider unfamiliar with the region. Rivers had spent years guiding visitors through the mountains and knew the terrain with unusual confidence. His weathered appearance and practical knowledge made him a trusted figure among those who traveled into the wilderness. To many people in the area, he seemed like someone who belonged to the forests as naturally as the old roads and streams surrounding them. Those who spent time with Mid-Dye Rivers remembered the quiet rhythm of his work. He moved comfortably among trees and ridges that others found confusing. The smell of damp leaves and fresh pine accompanied long days in the woods, while distant streams and bird calls formed the background to his routines. Fellow hunters trusted his judgment because he recognized landmarks that escaped most visitors. Being near him offered reassurance. His experience created the feeling that no section of the mountain could truly surprise a man who had walked those paths for decades. On the 16th of November, a small hunting group traveled together through the area. As the afternoon progressed, Rivers moved ahead of the others, something he had done many times before. There was nothing unusual about the decision. The group expected to catch up with him along the trail. Yet as daylight faded, a quiet concern began replacing that confidence. Familiar landmarks appeared, but Mid-Dye Rivers did not. What began as an ordinary day slowly shifted into uncertainty, and the forest that had always seemed known suddenly carried unanswered questions. Looking back now, what makes the moment so unsettling is its simplicity. There was no storm, no dramatic event, and no warning that something unusual was about to happen. A man respected for his knowledge entered familiar ground and failed to return. That single fact carried a weight difficult to ignore. People who knew the mountains accepted accidents and hardships, but this felt different. For many residents, the disappearance of Mid-Dye Rivers became more than a personal tragedy. It marked the beginning of a mystery that would quietly grow for decades. On the afternoon of November 16, 1945, Mid-Dye Rivers joined a group of hunters exploring the area near Hell Hollow and the slopes surrounding Glastonbury Mountain. The outing followed a pattern familiar to everyone involved. Rivers had guided countless trips through these woods and understood the changing terrain better than most people. He walked with confidence and often moved ahead to scout paths or identify landmarks. His companions trusted him completely. There was no reason to believe the day would become anything more than another ordinary journey through forests that Rivers had known for years. As the group continued through the woods, Rivers gradually moved beyond sight. Such behavior attracted little concern because his experience made it seem natural. He knew where streams crossed the trails and where the ridges opened toward easier routes. The others assumed they would meet him again farther along the path. Time passed without urgency. Hunters focused on their surroundings and expected the familiar guide to appear at any moment. But when daylight began slipping behind the mountains, an uncomfortable realization slowly emerged. Mid-Dye Rivers had failed to return. At first, his companions searched nearby areas, calling his name and checking the trails he usually favored. The woods answered with nothing beyond ordinary sounds. Dusk settled over the mountains, bringing colder air and growing shadows beneath the trees. Concern replaced patience. Rivers was not someone who became lost easily. His knowledge of the terrain had earned respect throughout the region. If anyone could navigate those forests safely, it was Mid-Dye Rivers. That belief made his absence difficult to understand. Something felt wrong, though nobody could explain exactly why. Word spread quickly through the surrounding communities. Local residents and experienced woodsmen gathered to help with the search. They combed familiar routes and examined streams, ridges, and abandoned logging roads. Searchers expected to discover some simple explanation. Perhaps Rivers had suffered an injury. Maybe he had chosen another route and become delayed. Yet hours turned into days without success. The mountain revealed no obvious clues. No equipment appeared. No footprints pointed toward answers. The silence surrounding his disappearance became increasingly unsettling because it contradicted everything people believed about the experienced guide. For those involved, the mystery carried a troubling quality that extended beyond the loss itself. Accidents happened in the wilderness, and residents understood those risks. But Mid-Dye Rivers represented knowledge and familiarity. He belonged to those mountains. His disappearance challenged assumptions that had guided generations of hunters and woodsmen. People found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. If someone like Mid-Dye Rivers could vanish without explanation, what did that say about the forests they believed they understood so well? In that quiet uncertainty, something deeper began to take shape around Glastonbury Mountain. The search for Mid-Dye Rivers expanded with a sense of determination that reflected the respect people held for him. Friends, hunters, and local residents entered the forests believing they would eventually bring the old guide home. Many of the men involved had known Rivers personally. Others had heard stories about his skill and reliability. They understood the terrain and expected that experience would lead them toward answers. Search parties spread across familiar routes, moving through valleys and climbing ridges that Rivers himself had crossed countless times over the years. What made the search unusual was the absence of clear evidence. Searchers found no damaged equipment and no signs of a struggle. Trails that Rivers had used before revealed nothing useful. Streams and ravines received careful attention. Dogs were brought in to assist, and experienced woodsmen retraced possible routes based on Rivers' habits. Every possibility seemed reasonable at first. An injury, exhaustion, or a simple mistake appeared more likely than anything mysterious. Yet each passing day weakened those explanations. The forests offered no details capable of explaining where the guide had gone. People familiar with Glastonbury Mountain struggled to accept that Rivers could become hopelessly lost. He had spent years moving through the region and understood its hidden paths better than most visitors. Stories about his experience circulated among those participating in the search. Some remembered hunting trips guided by Rivers. Others recalled how easily he identified landmarks that confused outsiders. That knowledge deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Searchers found themselves asking how a man so comfortable in those woods could disappear so completely. The question lingered because nobody could answer it with confidence. As days passed, concern gradually transformed into quiet disbelief. Families waited for news while neighbors discussed possible explanations in homes and local stores. Conversations grew more thoughtful. Some people blamed difficult terrain. Others wondered whether rivers had suffered a sudden illness. A few admitted that they had no explanation at all. There was no public panic, only a growing awareness that something unusual had happened. The mountain had absorbed many stories over the years, but this one felt different because it involved a man who seemed inseparable from the landscape itself. Eventually, the search ended without the answers everyone expected. Only a single rifle cartridge was reportedly discovered in the area, and even that offered little certainty. Mid-Dye Rivers remained missing. His disappearance left behind more questions than facts. For local residents, the event carried an unsettling message. A trusted woodsman had entered familiar territory and vanished without leaving a path home. Looking back now, that moment feels important, not because it provided answers, but because it introduced a new possibility. The mountains surrounding Glastonbury might hold secrets that experience alone could not overcome. In the weeks following Mid-Dye River's disappearance, life in the surrounding towns slowly returned to familiar routines, but conversations carried a different tone. Hunters continued entering the woods, and families prepared for winter as they always had. Yet his name appeared often in quiet discussions. People remembered specific trips, old stories, and moments shared with the guide. Neighbors exchanged thoughts while standing inside stores or sitting beside wood stoves after dark. No one spoke dramatically. Instead, there was a quiet effort to understand how someone so experienced had failed to come home. Among hunters and woodsmen, River's disappearance introduced a subtle change in behavior. Men who had spent years entering the forests alone became more careful about sharing their plans. Companions stayed closer together during long outings. Familiar landmarks received renewed attention. These were small adjustments rather than dramatic reactions, but they revealed something important. Confidence had been shaken. Mid-Dye Rivers represented the kind of knowledge others trusted. If he could vanish inside terrain he understood, then experience itself no longer seemed like a complete guarantee against danger. Stories about rivers spread beyond the immediate area as newspapers and conversations carried news to neighboring communities. Readers encountered the account of a respected guide who had disappeared without explanation. Most assumed that some practical answer would eventually emerge. Yet weeks became months, and no clear solution arrived. The mystery remained unfinished. Because so little evidence existed, people filled the silence with questions rather than conclusions. Each retelling emphasized the same troubling detail. Mid-Dye Rivers had known those woods better than almost anyone. That fact became impossible to separate from the story itself. Older residents who had spent decades near Glastonbury Mountain viewed the disappearance through the lens of memory. Some remembered earlier warnings passed down through families. Others thought about stories shared by hunters and travelers over the years. They did not claim supernatural explanations. Instead, many accepted that the mountains possessed qualities difficult to predict. Weather shifted suddenly. Trails changed. Fog altered familiar landmarks. These realities had always existed. Yet the loss of Mid-Dye Rivers caused people to reflect upon them with greater seriousness. Quiet respect for the landscape deepened into something harder to define. With time, the disappearance settled into local history, but it never truly faded from memory. New stories emerged, and other mysteries would eventually follow. Yet people continued returning to the name of Mid-Dye Rivers. His absence marked a turning point. Before 1945, strange impressions and old warnings surrounded Glastonbury Mountain. After his disappearance, those feelings acquired something more tangible. There was now a real person attached to the uncertainty. A guide trusted by everyone had entered the wilderness and never returned. That fact lingered long after search parties disappeared from the mountains. As the years passed, the disappearance of Mid-Dye Rivers slowly became more than a local tragedy. What had begun as the loss of a respected woodsman gradually settled into the larger story of the Bennington region. New residents heard his name through old conversations. Visitors encountered brief mentions in newspapers and local accounts. Yet even after decades, the mystery surrounding his final day remained remarkably simple. There were no dramatic last words and no reliable witnesses describing anything unusual. There was only a familiar forest and a man who never emerged from it again. Historians examining the case later discovered how few solid details existed. Most records focused on the search itself rather than on Rivers' personal life. He left behind no diary explaining his thoughts and no clear evidence that pointed toward a particular fate. Time only deepened the uncertainty. Memories faded. Witnesses grew older. Stories changed slightly with each retelling. Yet one fact remained constant throughout every version. Mid-Dye Rivers had entered territory he understood well. That detail prevented easy explanations from satisfying those who continued to revisit the mystery. As interest in the Bennington Triangle expanded during later decades, writers and researchers often returned to the disappearance of Mid-Dye Rivers as the beginning of something larger. They viewed his case as the first shadow that hinted at a strange pattern. Future disappearances would attract greater publicity, but Rivers occupied a different place within the story. He represented experience and familiarity. He was not a visitor lost in unknown terrain. He belonged to those mountains. That distinction gave his disappearance a quiet weight that later cases never fully replaced. Some people searched for extraordinary explanations, while others favored practical answers hidden somewhere within the landscape. The passage of time offered no clear victory to either side. The mountains remained silent, and evidence remained scarce. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the story continues to hold attention. Human nature seeks conclusions. We want events to fit neatly inside explanations. Yet the disappearance of Mid-Dye Rivers resisted that desire. It remained unfinished, suspended between possibility and mystery. In many ways, the unanswered questions became as memorable as the man himself. Looking back now, it becomes clear that something changed in November of 1945. Before that day, Glastonbury Mountain carried old stories and whispered cautions passed between generations. After Mid-Dye Rivers vanished, those quiet impressions acquired a face and a name. The mountain no longer held only legends and uneasy feelings. It held a mystery connected to a real person known by friends and neighbors. Without anyone realizing it at the time, the disappearance of one aging guide had opened the first chapter in a series of events that would eventually give the Bennington Triangle its darkest reputation. Mid-Dye Rivers was a legend, but his disappearance was a warning. A warning that the wilderness was keeping its secrets tight. But the mountain wasn't finished. Just a year later, the terror touched someone unexpected. A young, hopeful student, walking in the open daylight. What happened to Paula Welden would shatter the region's sense of safety forever. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Welden left her college campus in Bennington wearing a bright red jacket and set out for a walk. She was a student at Bennington College and carried no heavy equipment or supplies. Witnesses later remembered seeing her along the long trail, moving toward the wooded slopes near Glastonbury Mountain. Her appearance seemed ordinary and relaxed. Nothing about the day suggested danger. To those who noticed her passing by, she looked like a young woman enjoying a quiet afternoon outdoors. The trail offered a peaceful experience that many people found comforting. Cold December air drifted through bare branches, and fallen leaves covered sections of the path beneath soft afternoon light. The smell of damp earth mixed with pine and distant wood smoke carried from nearby homes. Hikers occasionally crossed paths and exchanged simple greetings before continuing onward. The sound of footsteps and rustling leaves accompanied the journey. For anyone walking that trail, the surroundings felt familiar and inviting rather than threatening, especially during the early hours before darkness approached. As the afternoon progressed, small moments quietly began slipping out of place. Witnesses reported seeing Paula farther along the trail, following a couple walking ahead of her. At some point, the distance between them increased. When they glanced back again, the young woman in the red jacket had disappeared from sight. Evening slowly settled across the mountains, and what had begun as an ordinary walk gradually transformed into uncertainty. Hours passed, and when Paula failed to return, concern spread beyond the trail and reached the people waiting for her. Looking back now, the details feel strangely simple. A young student decided to take a walk and entered a landscape that countless others had explored before her. Yet somewhere between familiar paths and approaching darkness, certainty disappeared. Her story carried a different weight from the case of Mid-Dye Rivers. Paula Welden was young, far from home, and surrounded by expectations for the future. Her disappearance touched something deeper. It forced people to consider that the wilderness around Bennington held questions that experience and confidence alone could not answer. Paula Welden had arrived at Bennington College with the quiet hopes shared by many young students after the Second World War. She came from Stamford, Connecticut, and had quickly adjusted to campus life. Friends remembered her as thoughtful and independent. Nothing in her recent behavior suggested distress or unusual concerns. On December 1st, 1946, she left her dormitory without attracting attention. Dressed warmly in a bright red jacket, blue jeans, and sneakers, she mentioned no elaborate plans. What seemed like a simple afternoon outing would soon become one of the most discussed disappearances in Vermont history. That Sunday unfolded with ordinary routines across the college campus. Students attended activities, relaxed with friends, and prepared for the coming week. Paula spent part of the day quietly before deciding to leave the campus grounds. Witnesses later recalled seeing her walking toward Route 9, where she accepted a ride from a local couple. The drive brought her closer to the long trail, a route known for its scenic beauty. Nothing about those moments raised concern. The young woman appeared calm, and her destination seemed no different from the many places hikers visited each year. As she entered the trail, other people noticed her presence. An older couple walking ahead remembered seeing the young woman following behind them at a comfortable distance. They occasionally glanced back and observed the bright color of her jacket against the fading afternoon landscape. At some point, however, they noticed something unexpected. The trail behind them had become empty. Paula was no longer visible. They assumed she had paused or changed her pace. There was no reason to think anything unusual had happened. Yet that brief observation would later become one of the final confirmed sightings connected to her disappearance. Back at Bennington College, concern developed slowly. Paula's absence initially appeared unremarkable because students often followed their own schedules. But as evening turned into night and she failed to return, friends and staff members grew uneasy. Attempts to locate her produced no answers. News reached her family, who struggled to understand how a simple walk could lead to silence. The situation soon expanded beyond personal worry. Local authorities became involved, and questions began spreading through surrounding communities. People hoped she had become delayed or sought shelter somewhere along the trail. Most believed a reasonable explanation would emerge with time. Instead, the uncertainty deepened. Paula Welden had vanished along a route traveled by many others, leaving behind almost no clues. The bright red jacket, remembered by witnesses, became a haunting image repeated in newspapers and conversations. Her disappearance transformed from a missing person case into something larger. Residents and investigators suddenly faced a troubling reality. A young woman had entered familiar woods during daylight hours and disappeared completely. The mountains surrounding Bennington had once again withheld their answers. As news of Paula Welden's disappearance spread, the response grew rapidly. Local authorities organized searches while volunteers from surrounding communities offered assistance. Friends, college staff, and ordinary residents joined efforts to retrace her possible route along the long trail. Searchers entered the woods with confidence that someone wearing a bright red jacket would be easy to locate. Many believed Paula had suffered an injury or become stranded somewhere nearby. At first, there was little sense of mystery. The expectation remained simple: find the young woman and bring her safely home. The scale of the search soon expanded beyond what Vermont had experienced before. Hundreds of volunteers entered the forests surrounding Glastonbury Mountain. Bloodhounds followed possible scents, and airplanes searched from above. Members of the National Guard became involved. Roads, streams, and abandoned logging routes received careful attention. Searchers examined cabins and questioned residents living near the mountains. Newspaper reporters arrived and carried updates across the country. Yet despite the growing effort, the search produced remarkably little. There were no reliable footprints, discarded belongings, or signs pointing toward a clear explanation. As days turned into weeks, theories began appearing alongside the search itself. Some believed Paula had become lost and succumbed to the harsh conditions. Others suggested she might have left voluntarily. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by the absence of evidence. Every reported sighting created brief moments of hope before collapsing under closer examination. Investigators traveled to distant locations following leads that eventually led nowhere. The mystery deepened because each possibility seemed incomplete. No explanation fully matched the known details. The silence surrounding her disappearance became more unsettling with every failed attempt to understand it. For Paula's family, the experience carried an unbearable uncertainty. They traveled to Vermont and remained close to the search efforts, hoping for news that never arrived. Her father even offered a reward for information and pursued leads personally. Newspapers captured the growing frustration shared by investigators and relatives alike. People who had never met Paula followed the case with quiet fascination. Her story touched something universal. An ordinary afternoon walk had transformed into a question that nobody seemed capable of answering. The lack of closure became its own form of pain. Months later, the search had ended, but the mystery remained. Paula Welden's disappearance had attracted national attention and exposed serious weaknesses in Vermont's ability to investigate missing persons. The case became one of the reasons the state eventually established its own police force. Yet beyond those changes lingered something harder to explain. A young woman had vanished along a public trail in broad daylight. Despite enormous efforts, the mountains had offered no answers. And in the minds of many residents, the name Paula Welden became inseparable from the growing shadows surrounding the Bennington Triangle. In the weeks following the disappearance, Bennington College felt different in ways that were difficult to describe. Students attended classes and followed their routines, yet conversations often returned to Paula Welden. Her empty place at the dormitory became a quiet reminder that someone was missing. Friends remembered small details about her habits and tried to reconstruct ordinary moments that had suddenly gained importance. Teachers, staff members, and classmates shared the same hope that news would eventually arrive. Instead, uncertainty settled over the campus, changing the atmosphere in subtle but lasting ways. Beyond the college, people throughout Vermont followed the case closely. Newspapers carried updates, and families discussed new developments around dinner tables and inside local stores. Residents who had never met Paula found themselves drawn into the mystery. The image of the young woman in the red jacket remained fixed in public memory. Parents thought about their own children. Travelers looked at the mountains differently. Hunters and hikers continued entering the woods, but stories about Paula often accompanied those journeys. Her disappearance had become something larger than a local tragedy. It had entered the consciousness of an entire region. Investigators faced increasing pressure as the search produced no clear results. Leads appeared and disappeared. Reported sightings created hope before collapsing under scrutiny. Rumors spread faster than facts, forcing authorities to separate possibilities from imagination. Without a statewide police force, Vermont relied on local agencies that struggled to coordinate efforts across different communities. The challenges exposed weaknesses that many people had never considered before. A missing person case of this scale demanded resources and organization that simply did not exist. In that sense, Paula's disappearance changed more than public attitudes. It revealed how unprepared the state had been. As months passed, attention gradually shifted elsewhere, but memories of the case remained. New events captured newspaper headlines, and daily life resumed its familiar rhythms. Yet those who had followed the search never forgot how abruptly everything had changed. The unanswered questions stayed alive because there had been no conclusion. Families remembered the photographs. Students remembered the campus atmosphere. Residents remembered the endless reports and failed leads. Time moved forward, but the mystery remained suspended in the background, waiting quietly inside memory. Looking back now, one can sense how deeply Paula Welden's disappearance affected the region. It brought strangers together through concern and introduced an uneasiness that stretched far beyond Bennington. People began viewing the wilderness with greater caution. Old stories about Glastonbury Mountain acquired new significance. A simple walk had become something impossible to explain. And with that realization, the mystery surrounding the Bennington Triangle grew darker, shaped not by legends alone, but by the absence of a young woman whose future had seemed only beginning. Years passed, yet the name Paula Welden continued to surface whenever people spoke about mysteries connected to southern Vermont. New generations encountered her story through newspaper archives, books, and conversations preserved by families who remembered the search. The details remained remarkably familiar. A bright red jacket, a winter afternoon, a trail traveled by countless visitors. These simple facts carried an unusual weight because they resisted explanation. Time changed many things around Bennington, but the questions surrounding Paula's disappearance remained unresolved, quietly surviving long after the search parties had left the mountains. Researchers and historians later revisited the case, hoping that distance might reveal something overlooked. They studied witness statements and examined old reports, searching for patterns hidden within the uncertainty. Different theories emerged over the years. Some focused on accidents within the wilderness. Others explored the possibility that another person had been involved. A few suggested that Paula had chosen to disappear. Yet every explanation encountered the same problem. Evidence remained limited. Facts ended where speculation began. The mystery endured because certainty never arrived to replace the countless possibilities surrounding her final journey. Unlike the disappearance of Mid-Dye Rivers, Paula Welden's case reached far beyond local communities. Newspapers across the country carried stories about the missing college student. Her photograph appeared beside headlines that captured public attention. People who had never visited Vermont became familiar with the mountains surrounding Bennington. In many ways, Paula's disappearance transformed the region itself. Places once known only to residents suddenly acquired a darker identity. Questions about the wilderness entered national conversations. The image of a young woman vanishing during an afternoon walk became difficult for people to forget. There is something deeply unsettling about how ordinary her final day appeared. Nothing suggested danger. She was not exploring unknown territory or attempting something extraordinary. She was a young student enjoying a walk through a landscape others considered beautiful and familiar. Perhaps that simplicity explains why her story continues to inspire curiosity. Human beings expect warnings before tragedy. We search for moments that reveal where events changed course. But in Paula Welden's case, those moments remain hidden. The transition from normal life to mystery occurred so quietly that nobody recognized it while it was happening. Looking back now, it becomes clear that Paula Welden's disappearance marked another turning point in the history of the Bennington Triangle. The mountains had already claimed one respected woodsman. Now they held the unanswered story of a young woman with an entire future ahead of her. Together, these cases began forming a pattern that people struggled to ignore. Long before strange theories and sensational headlines appeared, there were families waiting for answers that never came. And somewhere beyond the trails and forests of southern Vermont, the silence surrounding Paula Welden endured, carrying questions that have never fully faded. First an expert, then a student, but then the unthinkable happened. People didn't just vanish from the woods. They started disappearing from buses, from farms, from right under our noses. From a veteran to an 8-year-old boy, the patterns were breaking. The mystery was no longer confined to the trails. It was hunting in the open. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Bennington region had become linked to a series of disappearances involving people whose lives appeared completely unrelated. Among them were 8-year-old Paul Jepson and veteran James Tetford, men and women from different backgrounds, ages, and routines. Their stories unfolded in separate places and under different circumstances. Some vanished near forests while others disappeared during ordinary travel. Looking at the names together reveals no obvious connection. Yet each case became another piece added to the growing mystery surrounding southern Vermont. For residents following these events, the experience created a strange mixture of familiarity and unease. Newspaper headlines arrived with new details, while conversations inside homes and stores carried quiet speculation. The smell of coffee in diners and the sound of radios announcing updates became part of daily life. People recognized faces from photographs and imagined the routines behind them. Each story carried its own emotions. Families waited for answers. Communities listened closely. Beneath ordinary life, a growing sense of uncertainty slowly entered the atmosphere surrounding Bennington. As one disappearance faded from the headlines, another seemed to emerge. Search parties gathered and then dispersed. Investigators followed leads that gradually lost strength. Seasons changed, and life moved forward, yet the list of unanswered cases continued growing. There was no repeating pattern that people could easily recognize. Victims came from different worlds and vanished under different circumstances. That lack of consistency made the mystery more troubling. Familiar explanations that seemed reasonable in one case often failed completely when applied to another. Looking back now, what feels most unsettling is not the number of disappearances, but the absence of clear connections between them. Human beings naturally search for patterns because patterns offer comfort. Yet these stories refuse to fit neatly together. A child, a veteran, a college student, a guide. Their lives touched one another only through mystery. Perhaps that is why the Bennington Triangle captured attention beyond Vermont. It presented questions without providing a single answer, leaving behind a collection of stories connected only by uncertainty itself. By the time the late 1940s arrived, the disappearances connected to the Bennington region no longer seemed isolated. People began looking back at earlier cases and noticing that questions had accumulated faster than answers. Yet what stood out most was the lack of similarities among those who had vanished. There was no common profession, no shared destination, and no obvious relationship between the individuals involved. The mystery refused to settle into a simple narrative. Instead, it stretched across different lives, making each new disappearance feel strangely disconnected from the ones that came before. One of the most unusual cases involved James Edward Tetford, a military veteran who had spent years rebuilding his life after the hardships of war. In December 1949, Tetford boarded a bus while returning to the Bennington area. Fellow passengers later remembered seeing him seated normally during the journey. His belongings remained inside the vehicle, including personal items and luggage. Yet when the bus reached its destination, Tetford himself had vanished. No passenger recalled seeing him leave. His disappearance differed entirely from the stories connected to forests and mountain trails, adding another layer of uncertainty to the growing mystery. A few months later, another case brought fresh concern to the region. 8-year-old Paul Jepson lived near Bennington and often accompanied his mother during routine tasks. In October 1950, while she attended to farm animals, the young boy disappeared. Witnesses remembered him wearing a bright red jacket. Searchers quickly entered the area, believing the child could not have gone far. Dogs were brought in to help. Volunteers examined nearby fields and wooded sections. Yet despite their efforts, no reliable trace of the boy emerged. The case shocked local residents because it involved someone so young. The contrast between James Tetford and Paul Jepson highlighted something deeply unsettling. One was an adult veteran traveling among passengers. The other was a child who disappeared near his home. Their circumstances shared almost nothing. Traditional explanations seemed useful in one case but ineffective in another. People found themselves comparing details without discovering meaningful patterns. This lack of consistency complicated investigations and encouraged endless speculation. Every disappearance appeared to follow its own path, leaving investigators with separate mysteries rather than pieces of a single puzzle. As more names entered conversations, residents struggled to understand what connected them. Some focused on geography. Others searched for coincidences involving dates and locations. Yet certainty remained out of reach. Different ages, different routines, and different circumstances produced the same troubling result. People vanished, and answers failed to follow. In that growing collection of unanswered stories, the Bennington Triangle began acquiring a reputation that extended beyond local memory. What had once been individual tragedies slowly transformed into something larger and far more difficult to explain. Each disappearance brought with it a different kind of response. When experienced woodsmen vanished, people blamed the mountains. When a college student failed to return, concern spread through campuses and newspapers. When a veteran disappeared from a bus, attention shifted toward human witnesses and unanswered details. And when 8-year-old Paul Jepson vanished near his family farm, fear entered ordinary homes. Parents who had followed earlier stories suddenly imagined their own children in similar situations. The mystery no longer belonged only to forests and remote trails. It had moved closer to everyday life. Search efforts reflected the unique circumstances of each case. Volunteers entered the woods carrying lanterns and supplies. Police questioned passengers and examined schedules. Neighbors organized themselves to search roads, streams, and abandoned structures. Bloodhounds tracked scents that eventually disappeared. Reporters gathered information from families and witnesses. Yet despite the differences in methods, the results often followed a familiar path. Initial optimism slowly gave way to frustration. Promising clues faded. Witness accounts lost certainty. Days turned into weeks. In case after case, investigations reached the same difficult destination. Questions remained while answers drifted further away. Communities surrounding Bennington experienced these events in deeply personal ways. Shop owners discussed rumors with customers. Farmers exchanged theories while working their fields. Families sitting beside radios followed updates with growing concern. People remembered where they had been when they first heard certain names. Some became more cautious about traveling alone. Others avoided particular areas after dark. Yet there was no panic sweeping through the region. Instead, there was something quieter. A shared awareness that strange things had happened and that no one seemed able to explain them completely. What troubled many residents was not only the disappearances themselves, but the feeling that ordinary assumptions no longer provided comfort. People trusted routines. They believed experience offered protection. They expected witnesses to notice important details. But these cases challenged those expectations. James Tetford vanished despite being surrounded by other passengers. Paul Jepson disappeared close to home. Paula Welden entered a public trail in daylight. Mid-Dye Rivers knew the wilderness better than most. Familiar explanations worked for one story and collapsed when applied to another. That uncertainty settled heavily over conversations throughout the region. As the years passed, the names became linked through memory rather than evidence. No document connected them. No investigator uncovered a single answer tying every case together. Yet residents and outsiders alike continued placing the stories beside one another. They did so because the similarities were not found in age or circumstance. They were found in absence. Different people living different lives had entered ordinary days and somehow disappeared. And in that strange collection of unfinished stories, the mystery surrounding the Bennington Triangle grew stronger with every unanswered question. As the disappearances accumulated, newspapers began treating the stories differently. Earlier cases had been reported as individual tragedies, each separated by its own circumstances. Over time, however, journalists and readers started looking backward. Names that once appeared in isolated articles began sharing space in the same conversations. Reporters compared dates and locations. Editors revisited old headlines. What had seemed unrelated gradually acquired a larger context. The process happened slowly. No single article declared a pattern. Instead, curiosity grew through repetition, as people realized that too many questions remained unresolved. Families connected to the cases experienced this growing attention in different ways. Some welcomed renewed interest because it kept hope alive. Others found the speculation painful. Parents, spouses, and relatives wanted answers rather than theories. For them, newspaper stories and public discussions could never replace certainty. Every new article reopened old wounds. Memories that had settled quietly returned with fresh intensity. While outsiders focused on mystery, families remembered birthdays, conversations, and ordinary routines interrupted without warning. Their grief remained deeply personal, even as the stories became part of something larger in the public imagination. Investigators faced a difficult challenge. Each disappearance demanded separate explanations and separate methods. Evidence gathered in one case often provided no help in another. There were no reliable witnesses connecting the events. Timelines differed. Locations varied. Some disappearances involved forests, while others unfolded in entirely different settings. The lack of common details frustrated those searching for clear answers. People naturally expected patterns to reveal themselves over time. Instead, the collection of cases seemed to resist simple conclusions. That resistance became one of the most unusual aspects of the mystery itself. Meanwhile, stories continued spreading through Vermont communities. Travelers discussed them in diners. Hunters exchanged opinions during long drives home. Parents spoke quietly about them after children had gone to bed. The disappearances entered local folklore not because people agreed on explanations, but because nobody possessed one. Some favored practical theories. Others entertained stranger possibilities. Yet even those who disagreed shared the same uncertainty. The mountains, roads, and familiar places surrounding Bennington had become associated with unanswered questions. That connection grew stronger with every passing year. Looking back now, one can see how the emotional atmosphere around the region changed. The mystery no longer centered on one person or one event. It had expanded into something broader. Different stories carried different sorrows, but together they created a sense of unfinished history. People remembered names separated by age, background, and circumstance. A veteran, a child, a student, a guide. Their lives shared almost nothing except disappearance. And perhaps that absence of clear connections became the most unsettling connection of all, leaving behind a puzzle that seemed to grow more mysterious with time. By the middle of the 20th century, the disappearances surrounding Bennington had become more than a collection of local memories. People across New England recognized the names, even if they struggled to remember the details. Stories passed from one generation to another, changing slightly with time but preserving the same unanswered questions. The mysteries remained suspended between fact and speculation. Families remembered personal losses, while writers and researchers searched for patterns hidden beneath the surface. Yet decades later, certainty continued to feel strangely distant, as though the truth itself had slipped quietly beyond reach. What made these cases so unusual was the variety of people involved. Mid-Dye rivers represented experience and familiarity. Paula Welden symbolized youth and promise. James Tetford carried the memories of military service and years spent rebuilding his life. Young Paul Jepson reflected the innocence of childhood. They belonged to different worlds and followed different routines. None of them shared occupations, relationships, or daily habits. Looking at their stories together creates a strange impression. The differences stand out more clearly than the similarities, and somehow that contrast deepens the mystery rather than weakening it. Researchers have spent decades examining records and witness accounts, hoping to discover overlooked connections. Some focus on geography and timelines. Others study weather conditions or possible human involvement. Practical explanations remain possible in every individual case. Yet no single theory explains all of them convincingly. One answer may seem reasonable for a missing child, while another appears more likely for an aging veteran. The difficulty lies in trying to force separate mysteries into one explanation. Time has revealed many possibilities, but it has offered no final certainty capable of bringing every story together. Perhaps that is why the Bennington Triangle continues attracting attention. Human beings are comfortable with isolated tragedies because they often carry explanations. But mysteries involving different people and different circumstances challenge that sense of order. They leave behind gaps where certainty should exist. The mind searches for patterns, but these disappearances resist easy understanding. They remind us that not every question produces a satisfying answer. Sometimes events remain unfinished, lingering inside memory long after those who first experienced them have disappeared. Looking back now, the names connected to the Bennington Triangle feel less like a list and more like echoes from different lives interrupted without warning. A woodsman, a student, a veteran, and a child all entered ordinary days and somehow became part of the same shadowed history. Their stories did not fit neatly together, yet history placed them side by side. That strange arrangement transformed individual tragedies into something larger. And perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of all. Not that the disappearances happened, but that after so many years, the questions surrounding them continue to outlive the answers. 4 cases, for completely different lives. And yet, the same chilling result: total, impossible silence. We are staring into a void that defies logic, geography, and human reason. The evidence is scattered, but the truth is hiding in plain sight, waiting for the final pieces to align. We've reached the threshold of the ultimate discovery. The final, definitive truth about the Bennington Triangle is coming. I'll be back with the final life-changing conclusion, releasing in just 48 hours.